In this section, we'll share information about how respondents do their work, focusing on advocacy targets and tactics. A strong advocacy ecosystem requires diverse actors targeting different branches and levels of government and engaging in a wide variety of tactics. Organizations must be able to shift as needed to respond to different contexts, not just to advance on certain issues, but to have a voice and power in the policymaking landscape on all issues related to health equity in Colorado. To build a greater understanding about how advocates do their work, the survey asked about two main things. Where do advocates target their advocacy work? And what tactics do they engage in, and how skilled are they in these tactics? Looking at targets in terms of levels and branches of government, respondents are most focused at the state level, with fewer organizations working at the federal level overall, and are most focused on the legislative and executive branches across the board. In analysis, we broke out organizations that specifically serve communities of color, shown here in green, to compare against the larger ecosystem. These 50 organizations report targeting the state and federal levels less than the larger ecosystem, while being closest to the ecosystem at the local level. To gain a better understanding of which tactics are most represented, we asked respondents to rate their skill sets across advocacy tactics focused on the public, influencers, and decision makers. Influencers could include, for example, the media, community leaders, the business community, other advocacy organizations, among others. And decision makers could include elected officials, administrators, or judges, etc. These are mapped on the advocacy strategy framework across three outcomes. First, building awareness, understanding that a problem exists. Then building the will to act, believing that acting is important and can have an impact, and then pushing for concrete action. Looking at the ecosystem as reflected in these data, the size of the circle indicates the percentage of respondents that say they engage in each tactic, and the color represents the average skill level that organizations have. Respondents rated their organizations as beginner, developing, intermediate, or advanced for each skill. Darker blue shows the highest average skill sets, which were intermediate because fewer advocates rated themselves as advanced across the board. Lighter blue circles represent the next strongest skill sets, with averages ranging from higher developing to lower intermediate. And the green circles represent the lowest averages, from beginning to just developing. Looking at this visual, the most common and strongest skill sets are concentrated on influencers and decision makers, as we have highlighted. You can see that the circles in the highlighted section are generally larger, indicating that more advocates report engaging in these tactics, and that more of them are darker blue, indicating that on average, they have higher skill levels. Some of the highest reported skill levels include influencer education, testimonials and public comments, coalition building, and policymaker education. Fewer advocates report high skill levels in tactics that target the public overall, and even fewer that move the public to action, as you can see with the smaller and lighter circles in the highlighted section towards the top. The most common and strongest tactic in this section is leadership development of community members. Another common tactic is storytelling, though advocates reported a weaker skill set in this tactic. Respondents were also asked which tactics they rely on partners for instead of engaging in themselves. The highlighted circles reflect some of the important tactics that less advocates engage in themselves and more noted relying on partners for, including public policy or public polling or opinion research, legal advocacy and litigation, and voter engagement. The charts in the next few slides include the same tactics that we saw in the framework in the previous slides, but orient them to show the differences between organizations that prioritize communities of color and the full ecosystem. The blue circles show reported levels of engagement in each tactic for the full ecosystem, and the white circles show reported levels of engagement for organizations that seek to serve or represent communities of color. Red circles highlight the largest gaps between the two groups. Looking first at tactics focused on policymakers, organizations that seek to serve communities of color report an average of 10% less engagement in these tactics than the larger ecosystem. While some have smaller differences, the biggest gap here is in direct lobbying. The same pattern holds for tactics focused on influencers and cross-cutting tactics, with organizations prioritizing communities of color averaging 10% less engagement in these tactics. The largest gaps are in coalition building and policy analysis and research. The pattern changes for tactics focused on the public. While respondents overall report less engagement and weaker skill sets for tactics that target the public, organizations that prioritize communities of color report about the same or more engagement in these tactics. One notable gap in this section is that organizations prioritizing communities of color report about 10% more engagement in direct action and protest than the larger ecosystem. After reviewing the data about advocacy targets and tactics, reflect back on your organization. Which tactics are your strongest? Where does your organization seek support from partners? How do you share skills and collaborate with other advocates? And how can your organization increase its ability to achieve its outcomes?